All right, so we were talking in the last section about identifying the independent variables. And I had mentioned that an independent variable, it has to have at least two conditions in order for us to use it as a variable. Now you might think to yourself, well, duh, how can you do anything unless you have at least two conditions? But it's really common for students to think, well, I'm only interested in one thing, and so why would I test the other side of it? Well, if you're not going to test the other side of it, then there's no point in doing an experiment because you need to have some. It has to vary. The independent variable has to vary. So you have to have at least two conditions. Now, the other thing that I mentioned in the last piece was the dependent variable, and we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail in a little bit. But the dependent variable should depend, your score on the dependent variable should depend on which condition you're experiencing in the independent variable. So the dependent variable is the thing that we're going to measure. The independent variable is the thing we're going to control. So for this next section where we're talking about controlling, once you've identified the conditions that you want to have, or the variables that you think might be important in contributing to the outcome on the dependent variable, you have to figure out a way to control those variables. So let's go back to my little chart here. Okay, so we're obviously going to have control over whether they're seeing the scene at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. Okay, so we have clearly this one is what's called a manipulated variable. We're in charge of it. Okay, so that's looking good. Here, experience is going to be something that the participant brings with them. They have the experience that they have accrued over time, playing the games or not, right? So experience is going to be something that we call a subject variable. The subject brings it with them. So we have one, what we call manipulated independent variable, which is frame rate. And then we're going to have one subject variable, which is experience, how much time they've spent playing the game. Both of these are independent variables. This one, frame rate, I'm going to control by presenting the scene at either 60 or 120 frames. That makes sense. I'm in control of it. I'm manipulating it. I determine your experience with it. Because the participant is bringing with them their expertise or their novice status, that I can't control. So this is a variable that can only be measured, and I can assign you to the expert condition or I can assign you to the novice condition based on your score on the measurement. Whatever I decide to do, we're still discussing that in our design. We're trying to figure out, should we just ask them? Do you consider yourself to be an expert or a novice, or should we ask them how many hours per week and then infer that they are experts or novices? Or we're still trying to decide how we're going to put them into these categories. And that's really the problem with measured independent variables, is that we don't have control over it. I can't make a person be an expert and make another person be a novice. I can't make that happen. I can't manipulate it. So for a true experiment, I can't use experience as a variable. If I want to do a true experiment, I have to have complete control over the independent variables. So I've been trying to explain that to my research assistants, that maybe we should start with just a completely controlled, true experiment to get started with, where the only thing that we're going to use as our independent variable is the one thing that we can manipulate, which is the frame rate. Then in experiment 2, introduce a non-manipulated independent variable that we don't have control over, that is expertise. And then in experiment 3, introduce another variable, which is whether they play PC or they play console. That takes a lot more time, but definitely you have more control over your variables if you do it in that way. But these are the kinds of things you have to consider while designing the experiment. You can't think about them midstream, or else you've just lost all your time and energy. Now the data, when we're designing the experiment, we have to figure out how are we going to collect the data. So, for example, one of the things we're trying to figure out with our experiment is, should the participants say out loud whether they think it's 60 or 120 frame rates, and then the research assistant writes down their response for each trial? Or should we set up the computer that's showing the scene to also be able to collect their response, and that way that each trial has embedded with it their response, and then we know what the frame rate was for the trial because it's embedded code, and so on. How are we going to collect the data is basically the question. We're trying to figure it out. So that takes a lot of time to try and make sure that you know how exactly you're going to get exactly the data that you need, the dependent variable scores that you need. Once you've collected it, of course, the next thing to do is analyze the data, and that's to apply statistics to the data. Now here's a good cartoon that kind of raises an issue that's been hotly debated in psychology. Should you be taking a research methods class before you've taken your stats class and don't even really know what you would do with the data that you would collect? Or should you always have to take a stats class before a research methods class? Well, I think you know how Bellevue College has decided on this if you're a Bellevue College student, right? Because Bellevue College has you taking research methods and not taking stats first. Other schools break it up. At Eastern Washington University, we have the first level of research methods. We actually call it just scientific principles, and kind of introduce all these concepts that I'm introducing right now. Then you take stats. Then you take the full-blown research methods class after stats, which is what most of you who are, if you're taking this class as a Psych 209 class, you're taking this class as what will transfer over as a Psych 309 class in an upper division psych program. All the psych programs that require 309 of psych majors have that same basic principle where they're going to have you take Psych 309, then they're going to have you take stats, then they're going to have you take the full-blown research methods class. Hopefully the reiteration of the concepts will make the data analysis make more sense the second time you take research methods. When you take research methods, again, these things that I'm introducing here will make a lot more sense, because then you'll know what you would do with the data, what kind of analysis would make sense, and then we revisit the methods, and then you start to say, oh yes, 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 now I see how it goes together. So I hope you enjoyed that Harley Davidson going past my office because it was rumbling. All right, so yeah, you don't want to be in the situation of this doctor who's saying, you know, what test am I supposed to use? A lot of us find ourselves in that circumstance. I've been in that circumstance when I've collected data. A lot of times I've made my experimental design and I've planned for a particular data analysis. And then once I've gotten the data back and I've conducted that data analysis, I realize there's another question that really should be answered by this same set of data. If I used a different statistical analysis, I could answer the question, but I can't remember what statistic I should be using to answer that question, right? So it's not unusual to be a researcher, be in the midst of doing your research and start to ask yourself, what am I doing again? That's not unusual. It's just in your experimental design, you should have a plan for what you're going to do with your data. You can amend that plan as your data analysis goes on. That's completely normal. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back and talk about the KISS method of conducting research.